What would a distributed governance system look like? And I would like to visualize this thinking about a social media governance system where you have everybody on the social media platform voting on which rules they want in place and allowing for some different structures such as opt-in or such as sub-communities that have different sets of rules. But first, let's just get a framework for what distributed looks like and how it compares to centralized versus decentralized. Centralized has that central node, and a lot of times this is the same as a hierarchical structure. But the key with centralized is all of the decisions are sort of executed and adjudicated at a central node. And of course, the worry there is that central node can be hijacked or that central node can be taken over or it can become untrustworthy in some way. Decentralized is different from distributed because decentralized will oftentimes have a structure where there are many different communities, but each of those communities may have a centralized point. So the communities may be connected to each other in some way that is not necessarily through the centralized node, but decentralized doesn't necessarily have to be distributed. So distributed is where the connections between people are much more equal and there are many, many pathways from any one node to any other node. It's not that you have to go through the community centralized node and then get to your next node. It's if the community central node is compromised in some way, then there's many other pathways through the network to that other player. Okay, so if we're going to talk about governance on a distributed network, it's helpful to bring up blockchain. And I want to add a little asterisk here to just say, I think it's possible at least that there could be other tools besides blockchain that accomplish the same thing. But right now I'm just going to describe it as blockchain because blockchain definitely works for some of these properties. So if you're going to have centralized governance, you need something that can upload the same set of rules on everybody in the network at the same time. Because if rules have to pass from one person to another, you get the telephone problem where those rules might change or be altered as they move through the network, and you could get a situation where ultimately you would not have consensus. And of course, governance really is about a community, so there is this centralized-like element to governance where everybody is under the same umbrella rules. But with distributed governance networks, you want to accomplish that without that centralized node. So you really need this synchronized, unified thing happening that's going to decide collectively at the same time. Now everybody in the network is under this particular governance rule. So let me give a specific example here. Let's say this network that I've just drawn is a social media community and they have enough infrastructure in place to actually enforce rules across the entire social media network. And of course, these rules could have to do with algorithms. There's different ways of enforcing these rules. This video is not about enforcement, so I'm just going to assume there are ways of enforcing. And let's say there are a couple of different rules that are being proposed that the whole community gets to vote on. So here are some rules that we might be voting on to see, are these rules that we want to govern everybody on the platform? And one rule might be no giving out home addresses or phone numbers of other people on the network. Another rule might be no pornography, or no criticizing a religious leader or a leader of a country in any way. So the trick here with distributed governance is that some rules, everybody wants everybody else on the platform to be upholding those rules, or they're not going to feel safe on the platform. Like if there are people who are going to bully you by giving out your home address and telling people to go harass you because of your political beliefs or your religious beliefs or whatnot, that's not a safe place for you to actually be. So we might imagine that the community might want to vote rule number 1 for everybody. And even if 10% or 20% of people did not like that rule, you could have the whole community saying, we want that rule for everybody, even those who disagree. That's what governance is. So you might imagine a smart contract that simply allows everybody to vote. And if over 50% or over 75% or whatever percent you want to come up with agree to something, then that rule holds on the entire platform. And once that vote has come in, you can have smart contracts that will sort of automatically add that to the constitution of the social media network. And of course, you need enforcement mechanisms in place, which might involve bots, or those enforcement mechanisms might involve moderators who have a certain amount of power to enforce the rules. The moderators might be held accountable in other ways. Now, all of these governance structures are going to require some intricacy in terms of how exactly they're structured and enforced. But the point when I'm talking about distributed governance here is that this network of people is allowing rules to be proposed and rules to bubble to the top of some sort of voting agenda, and the whole community to vote on them, and those to sort of be added to the Constitution without going through a central party. So it's worth acknowledging that it's a little bit weird that this distributed network actually has a centralized constitution ruling that community of people. But it can be done. Now, let's consider these other two rules to be thinking about what other kinds of structures could there be? For example, let's say both of these other two rules did not pass the 50% majority. So we didn't have enough people to make them rules for everybody. In which case, we have a couple of different options. And one of those options is just an opt-in option. For example, for the pornography, I would not want pornography and I don't want to see it. I want to keep it out. I would hope that bots and moderators would actually enforce a rule like that. But I might be in the minority. Other people might want access to that. But I would be perfectly happy as long as I could opt in to say, hey, I'm fine if there are people with pornography out there in this network. I'm fine interacting with them. I can be friends with them, but I don't want to see it myself. In which case, I'm just opting in to a certain set of rules that is enforced among the people who opt in. That's pretty simple. And the opt-in option is really good if you care about your exposure, but you don't really care about other people on the network. With this other rule, the rule about the religious leader or the leader of a country, the problem is if you are from a country where the leader of the country has tight controls over your use of internet, or if you're in a religious group where there's tight controls or there's sort of shaming if you're interacting with, bad people or people who are criticizing your religion, whatever, then you actually can't really participate in the network as long as there are people out there who are criticizing your leader. And so, of course, the issue with that is there are probably a lot of people in the network who are like, fine, I have no desire to criticize your religion or your country's leader. That's just not something I'm going to be talking about. I would rather have you in the network than lose you because there are people out there criticizing your leader. And so you could imagine that rule actually being a pretty contentious rule if you're trying to decide it for the whole distributed community. However, if you could parse out a portion of that community and say, this is the segment of the network where everybody who opts into this agrees not to criticize this particular religious or country leader. And as long as you're doing that, you can share memes and share cat videos, and you can say anything you want as long as it's not criticizing this particular person or group. So distributed governance systems could have ways of parsing out the community into different sets of rules, where perhaps you're only exposed to other people who are in a rule set that you're comfortable with what they're doing and with what they're saying. In which case you could have votes that just apply to a certain subset of the network. And then you could vote on the rules for that subset, and people who belonged to that religion or were from that particular country, they could participate in that subset of the network. They just couldn't go to the other part of the network that had people who were criticizing their government. Now, of course, when you're imagining this seems like it could get really political, right? There could be all these battles between groups about you shouldn't join people who vote for that particular law. I don't even want to be in a network with those people. You could imagine all of that going on. And I think one of the things, if we're talking about governance, is there will always be that political element. There will always be that element that involves shaming and social leveraging and strategic behavior. All of that is going to be in place if we're talking about governance. But the distributed governance model allows for different structures that might be more flexible than just the CEO of the social media company makes all of the governance decisions, which are essentially just trying to maximize profit. Now, one more thing I want to say is that the devil's in the details with a lot of these, and with a lot of governance systems. One of the problems is that people don't want to be constantly voting on the rules of the governance, right? If there's going to be a new rule you have to vote on every single day or every single week, that gets pretty tiresome. So using something like liquid democracy or representative democracy, where it's like, okay, yeah, there's going to be new rules coming up every so often, you can elect somebody else to vote for you. And maybe that person can pass their votes along to someone else. That's liquid democracy. So having ways that the decisions can be voted on in a way that you have chosen, that every person involved has chosen, but that doesn't require so much effort. I think that's going to be key if we want these to actually work. And then another detail you have to think about is how can people propose a new law, and how much support does that need from other people in terms of, signing the petition or some electronic equivalent before that proposal actually gets voted on? Because if anyone can propose anything and it gets voted on, then the amount of voting is just going to overwhelm the system, and it's just going to kind of go crazy, and the people who are putting the most effort into proposing things are going to have outsized power. So you need a set of rules that determine what kinds of things get voted on in the first place. What's the process for proposing a new rule that might be added to the Constitution? How much support do you need from other people before that actually gets voted on? And a lot of these are just parameters. Like maybe 5% of the network has to sign the petition before it gets voted on. Maybe 90% of the network needs to agree to it before it goes to the Constitution. Maybe there are test laws. There are so many little questions with their own little parameters that you would have to play around with to make something like this work.